Welcome to Fluent Talk. I'm Ela, and this is Ben. Today we are not debating policy, we are debating survival. We're using hypothetical scenarios to test the limits of our ethics. Our first dilemma: if rising sea levels displace 100 million people, should affluent nations be legally required to accept all climate refugees?
Welcome, Ela. That scenario highlights the brutal reality of the climate crisis. While the humanitarian need is undeniable, a nation's ability to absorb millions of people must be governed by national sovereignty and infrastructure. Mandatory acceptance without considering the receiving country's resources or social cohesion risks causing a domestic public health crisis and economic collapse.
But Ben, the concept of a climate refugee doesn't fit the existing legal framework for asylum seekers. These people are fleeing conditions, rising seas, desertification that were primarily caused by the historical carbon footprint of those very affluent nations. We have a moral and arguably a legal social responsibility to provide them safety.
I agree on the social responsibility for the cause, but the logistics are different. We must update the legal framework to acknowledge climate as a legitimate reason for displacement, yes, but mandatory acceptance violates sovereignty. The immediate focus should be on massive international funding for resettlement infrastructure in safer regions closer to home, not immediately overwhelming stable nations.
It sounds like you are prioritizing the preservation of sovereignty over the preservation of life. These are people whose homes simply vanished. If we don't treat this as an immediate human rights issue, we are essentially building a legal wall around our own wealth and safety, ignoring the core environmental justice aspect of the crisis.
I understand the ethical urgency, Ela, but without maintaining national sovereignty, the receiving country loses the infrastructure and stability required to integrate refugees successfully. The legal framework needs to evolve, focusing on global burden sharing, treating this as a shared liability rather than just a moral requirement for a few affluent nations. We've just grappled with climate refugees, national sovereignty, and the legal framework. This is a massive issue. Stay with us. We will define social responsibility and environmental justice in the vocabulary summary.
The stakes are getting higher. If we can't agree on who is responsible for the people displaced by climate change, how far can we go to stop the displacement itself? Next, scenario 2. Should the government mandate dangerous geoengineering? The stakes are getting higher. If we can't agree on who is responsible for the people displaced by climate change, how far can we go to stop the displacement itself? Next, scenario 2. Should the government mandate dangerous geoengineering?
This is the break glass in case of emergency scenario. Geoengineering, things like solar radiation management, might be our only tool left if global emissions targets are completely missed. If a government decides the survival of the nation is at stake and they have strong scientific consensus that it will stabilize temperatures, then yes, they may have a non-democratic mandate to deploy it to prevent catastrophic failure.
That is an ethical disaster. You are talking about fundamentally altering the planet's atmosphere, messing with a global ecosystem without the public trust or the consent of billions of people who will be affected by the unintended consequences. This violates the core principle of democratic process and treats the climate crisis like a military decision.
But Ela, the democratic process is notoriously slow. Climate change is moving fast. The government's primary duty is to protect its citizens from existential threats. If they wait for perfect scientific consensus and global public approval, it might be too late. The law already allows governments to bypass normal processes during a declared emergency.
We have to be clear. Deploying geoengineering without absolute certainty is pauses for emphasis, a planetary gamble.
But delaying action until we have 100% public trust is a guarantee of environmental collapse.
A planetary gamble? That's exactly the kind of risk we can't afford. What if the unintended consequences are regional drought, impacting global food security? The lack of democratic process means there is no accountability when things inevitably go wrong.
The state must weigh the certainty of collapse versus the risk of the fix. If the scientific community provides a strong scientific consensus that geoengineering is the only way to save the majority, the government may claim emergency powers. However, they must simultaneously create a global fund to compensate for any unintended consequences to maintain public trust. We've just discussed geoengineering, public trust, and unintended consequences. Do you think governments have the right to play God? Stay with us. We will define scientific consensus and democratic process in the vocabulary summary.
That brings us back to justice. If wealthy nations took the risk, they should pay the price. Next, Scenario 3. Should wealthy nations be legally penalized for their historical carbon debt? That brings us back to justice. If wealthy nations took the risk, they should pay the price. Next, Scenario 3. Should wealthy nations be legally penalized for their historical carbon debt?
The term carbon debt refers to the excess historical emissions by industrialized nations, primarily the West, that put the developing world at risk. Morally, I understand the need for reparations, but legally, how do you measure and enforce centuries of shared liability across multiple generations? It is an extremely difficult proposition for international law.
But Ben, environmental justice demands we try. The nations suffering the most today, island states, sub-Saharan Africa, contributed the least to historical emissions. Their struggle is a direct result of the industrialization of the wealthy North. Viewing it as a carbon debt, an ethical theft, is necessary to force a large-scale transfer of wealth, technology, and funds for adaptation.
While the moral argument for reparations is compelling, focusing entirely on historical emissions risks paralyzing present-day action. We should focus on creating a mandatory global fund based on current emissions and current wealth to manage the ongoing shared liability of the climate crisis. Chasing a centuries-old carbon debt through the courts drains resources from effective change.
Not chasing it is accepting the injustice. We have to acknowledge that climate change is a fundamental denial of environmental justice. It's the highest form of ethical theft. The atmosphere was treated as a free waste dump.
Ethical theft is a powerful rhetorical device, Ela, but under what legal framework would you enforce it? How do you fairly allocate the precise carbon debt between the early 19th century UK and the modern-day US? We must define a clear, enforceable structure for shared liability today, not a retrospective, politically impossible one.
The point is not the complexity of the calculation, but the necessity of the principle. Recognizing carbon debt is recognizing environmental justice. It forces the affluent world to take genuine social responsibility, not just by paying for technology transfer, but by providing genuine reparations for the damage caused by their historical emissions. We've just discussed environmental justice, carbon debt, and historical emissions. If you believe the past dictates the future, stay with us. We will define reparations and shared liability in the vocabulary summary.
Justice demands accountability, but freedom demands choice. If we can't get nations to pay, maybe we should force individuals to consume less. Next, Scenario 4. Should meat consumption be legally rationed?
Justice demands accountability, but freedom demands choice. If we can't get nations to pay, maybe we should force individuals to consume less. Next, Scenario 4. Should meat consumption be legally rationed?
Absolutely not. This is a massive overreach of government power. Rationing meat or any food is a direct attack on individual liberty and the ultimate example of the nanny state. The way to achieve sustainable consumption is through education, incentives, and innovation in cultured meat, not coercion.
But Ela, red meat production has an enormous carbon footprint and is highly inefficient in terms of resource utilization. If global scientific consensus dictates that we cannot hit climate targets without drastically reducing consumption, then rationing becomes a necessary tool for resource optimization to ensure long-term food security for everyone. This is a matter of collective survival, not personal preference.
But who gets to decide the ration? It creates a black market and disproportionately harms lower-income families for whom meat is a crucial source of nutritional value. The state dictating what you eat in your own home is an unprecedented violation. You cannot enforce sustainable consumption by violating individual liberty.
I know the term nanny state is politically toxic, Ela, but we are facing an existential crisis. The current levels of meat consumption are fiscally and environmentally unsound. We are talking about resource optimization, using land and water efficiently. Rationing, if implemented equitably, is simply a transparent way to allocate a scarce resource that directly affects the planet's carbon footprint.
If the government truly wants sustainable consumption, they should tax the carbon footprint of production, not police the plates of individuals. The core moral argument remains: you cannot sacrifice individual liberty at the altar of resource optimization without fundamentally undermining democracy itself. We've just discussed sustainable consumption, individual liberty, and the carbon footprint. Do you think the government should control your diet? Stay with us. We will define resource optimization and the nanny state in the vocabulary summary.
If we can't control the people, maybe we should control the land. Next, scenario 5. Should human development be entirely halted in areas of high biodiversity?
If we can't control the people, maybe we should control the land. Next, scenario 5. Should human development be entirely halted in areas of high biodiversity?
Absolutely yes. Ecological preservation must be the priority here. Areas of high biodiversity are the planet's life support systems. They are irreplaceable. When faced with the threat of species extinction, the intrinsic value of nature outweighs the immediate short-term economic gains from sustainable development in those specific zones.
But entirely halted is an extreme position that violates the human rights of communities that have lived in those areas for generations. You can't just draw a line and say, stop building. Land use must be negotiated, and the solution is sustainable development. Integrating conservation into development plans, not blanket prohibition.
But sustainable development still means compromise. Biodiversity is the one thing we truly cannot replace with technology or economics. Therefore, for truly pristine areas, the government has a social responsibility to protect them, even if it means compensating citizens for relocation. It's an investment in the planet's natural capital.
If the state decides that ecological preservation serves a greater public good, it can use the principle of eminent domain, the right of the government to take private property for public use, provided it pays just compensation. However, the compensation must be robust, and the forced relocation must be a last resort. We need a clear legal standard for defining high biodiversity to avoid abuses of power.
Eminent domain? That's easy for the government to invoke, but where do those families go? Who ensures their new home provides the same quality of life or cultural connection? The discussion on ecological preservation must start with human rights and compensation, not just the technical legality of taking their land.
You're right. The legal framework must enforce fair compensation and provide new infrastructure. Ultimately, the choice between sustainable development and absolute ecological preservation is a painful one, but a necessary one to ensure the survival of biodiversity for future generations. We've just discussed ecological preservation, biodiversity, and eminent domain. If you had to choose between a forest and a new city, what would you choose? Stay with us. We would define sustainable development and land use in the vocabulary summary.
That was our last scenario, and it covered the ultimate dilemmas of our time. Now it's time to consolidate all these challenging new terms so you can debate them yourself. That was our last scenario, and it covered the ultimate dilemmas of our time. Now it's time to consolidate all these challenging new terms so you can debate them yourself.
Welcome to the final segment. Today, we've chosen 7 core terms that define the extreme edges of climate policy and ethics. Listen closely and repeat them out loud. First, climate refugees. These are people forced to leave their homes due to sudden or gradual alterations in the natural environment linked to climate change. Example, the current legal framework does not adequately protect climate refugees.
Next, geoengineering. This refers to the deliberate, large-scale intervention in the Earth's climate system to counteract global warming. Example, geoengineering carries a high risk of unintended consequences.
Third, carbon debt. This is a moral or legal concept stating that developed countries owe the developing world compensation for their past historical emissions. Example, advocates for environmental justice demand the repayment of carbon debt.
Fourth, environmental justice. This is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people in the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws and policies. Example, environmental justice requires addressing systemic bias.
Fifth, individual liberty. This refers to the freedom of an individual to act, speak, or think without external restraint or control from the government. Example, mandatory meat rationing would be a violation of individual liberty.
Sixth, ecological preservation. This is the protection of habitats, species, and ecosystems from human activity or destruction. Example, ecological preservation is prioritized in areas of high biodiversity.
And finally, eminent domain. This is the power of the state to take private property for public use, provided that just compensation is paid to the property owner. Example, eminent domain could be invoked for large-scale ecological preservation.
Those scenarios truly push the boundaries of what we are willing to sacrifice for the planet. Thank you, Ben, for navigating the legal complexities.
And thank you, Ile, for reminding us of the human and ethical cost. Our final question for you. Do you believe individual liberty must be restricted to ensure ecological preservation? Answer below.
Remember to hit that subscribe button. We post a brand new episode with fresh debates and essential vocabulary every single day at 6 a.m. on the English Easy channel.
We'll see you next time. Bye for now.